Welcome to Conspiracist. Today, we're diving into a hypothesis that, well, it definitely raises some big questions. It's about individual autonomy, government transparency, specifically the idea that evidence of something called subconscious remote control might have been intentionally hidden by governments.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic, definitely sensitive.
Absolutely. So, just to be clear up front, our goal here is to stay strictly professional, really objective. We're just going to look at the claims and the reasoning in the materials we have.
Exactly. We're not here to endorse anything, just to examine the information provided. It touches on technology, history, belief. It's complex.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What exactly is this hypothesis about? When we talk about subconscious remote control, what are we actually discussing?
Well, the core idea is that external groups, specifically governments in this context, might have ways to influence our subconscious minds remotely.
Remotely, so not face-to-face.
Right. And it's not about, shouting commands at your conscious brain. It's supposed to be more subtle, like influencing thoughts, feelings, maybe even actions, but below the level of conscious awareness.
Without you knowing it's happening.
Exactly. Without conscious awareness or, crucially, consent. That's the central claim.
That reminds me of something in one of our sources, a Reddit discussion. It kind of framed conscious awareness itself as maybe secondary, like the subconscious is the real driver.
That's an interesting perspective presented there, yeah. The argument was essentially that the subconscious handles so much bodily functions, memories, processing, that it's the primary system. And conscious awareness, maybe it's more like a specialized tool, evolved for certain things, like dealing with novelty or complex planning.
So the idea is decisions might actually start subconsciously before we're even aware of making them.
That's the implication in that post, yes.
Yeah.
That the conscious mind sort of catches up or rationalizes what the subconscious has already initiated.
Okay, so if the subconscious is this, powerful underlying force, could it be manipulated? That seems to connect to subliminal messages. What do our sources say about those?
Subliminal stimuli, right. Messages presented too quickly or faintly to be consciously noticed. There has been research looking into whether they can trigger emotions, maybe influence certain brain pathways like fear responses.
But does it work? Can it actually control people?
Well, that's where it gets murky. The evidence seems pretty mixed. Some studies might show a small effect, but whether they can be used for reliable therapy or, compel complex behaviors, that's heavily debated. There's no real consensus on strong, consistent effects.
Okay, so maybe limited influence, but it sets a stage. Which brings us to governments actually trying to achieve mind control. M-culture is the big one here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't really discuss this topic without mentioning M-culture.
Yeah.
This was the CIA's program, started in the mid-1950s. It was a documented effort to research mind control, behavioral modification, a lot of it driven by Cold War fears, concerns about Soviet or Chinese brainwashing techniques they thought were being used.
And the methods they used, these weren't just questionnaires, were they? The materials suggest some pretty extreme stuff.
Oh, definitely not. They experimented heavily with various chemical substances, barbiturates, morphine derivatives, hallucinogens were a big focus, LSD, mescaline.
And they gave these to people.
Often without their knowledge or consent. That's a key point. Trying to see if these drugs could break people down, make them suggestible, extract information. It's quite disturbing. Some of it even drew on earlier unethical Nazi experiments.
But it wasn't only drugs, right? M-culture was broader.
That's correct. It was an umbrella for many sub-projects that looked into hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, psychological manipulation, basically a wide net cast to understand influencing the human mind. And there were related projects, too, like Bluebird and Artichoke, which specifically looked into things like hypnosis for creating potentially unwitting assassins. Really dark territory.
The lack of consent is just staggering. And we don't even know the full story, do we? Because records were destroyed.
That's a major issue. In 1973, a large number of M-culture files were deliberately destroyed. So piecing together the full scope, what they found, the consequences, it's incredibly difficult. It leaves huge ethical questions unanswered about government research.
Okay, so that's the documented historical government interest. Fast forward to now, we have claims about contemporary subconscious remote control. One source, a blog post, makes some pretty dramatic allegations.
Yes. This particular post alleges that government agencies, it names the FBI and NSA, are currently running widespread, non-consensual experiments, using technologies it calls synthetic telepathy and psychotronic weapons. And it claims this is happening to, a very large number of citizens.
Synthetic telepathy, psychotronic weapons, those are strong terms. What specific capabilities does the blog claim these involve?
It asserts the NSA has something called remote neural monitoring, or RN. The claim is this tech can remotely map brain activity.
Map brain activity, like reading minds.
Essentially, yes. It claims RNM can visualize thoughts, even send images directly into someone's visual cortex. For brain programming, it says, especially during sleep. The post also mentions using microwave radiation to cause various physical and psychological symptoms in targeted individuals.
Wow, okay, but we need to be really clear here. These are allegations from one blog post, correct? Our other materials don't confirm these specific current technologies exist or are being used like this.
That's absolutely crucial. This blog presents these as claims, personal accounts. They aren't verified by the other information we've looked at. It's important to make that distinction very clear.
And the comments on that blog mention things like Project Monarch and HARP, often linked to these kinds of theories.
Yes, those terms pop up in the comments, often associated in conspiracy circles with mind control technology narratives. But again, presented without independent verification in our sources.
Okay, so these are extraordinary claims. What does the broader scientific community think about the possibility of achieving that kind of precise, remote mind control described there?
Well, the general scientific consensus reflected in some of our materials is pretty skeptical, at least about the kind of reliable, fine-tuned control often shown in, say, science fiction or alleged in that blog post. The human brain is just incredibly complex. We're talking billions of neurons, intricate connections, constant electrochemical activity. It's not simple.
One source mentioned we don't fully understand the neural code, right? Unlike, say, the genetic code.
Exactly. Neuroscience has come a long way, but understanding precisely how thoughts, emotions, intentions actually arise from all that neural firing. We're not there yet. So the idea that there's a simple code you can just hack into remotely to control thoughts with precision, that's not supported by current mainstream science.
But what about earlier work? The blog mentioned Dr. Jose Delgado and his stimoceiver. Didn't that show some kind of remote control?
Delgado's work is interesting, definitely. Back in the mid-20th century, he developed this device, the stimoceiver. It could wirelessly stimulate specific brain regions with electrical signals. And his experiments, famously one with a bull, showed you could influence behavior, elicit emotions like pleasure or aggression, trigger movements in animals and even human subjects by stimulating certain brain areas.
That sounds pretty close, though. Why didn't that become widespread mind control?
Well, even Delgado himself admitted the limitations. He said the tech was too unreliable and crude for precise mind control. A key reason was exactly what we just discussed, not understanding the neural code. You could trigger a feeling or movement, but you couldn't implant complex thoughts or orchestrate specific, detailed actions reliably. The brain's complexity was, and still is, a major hurdle for that kind of precision.
So direct stimulation can have effects, but it's far from remote thought control. What about going back to that subtler idea, subliminal perception? Scientifically speaking, can things we don't consciously notice actually sway our decisions?
There's research on this, yes. Some studies suggest stimuli below the conscious threshold can have a subtle influence. They might prime certain thoughts or slightly affect emotional states or subsequent choices.
Subtle influence, but is it powerful enough to, say, override someone's intentions or control their behavior on a large scale?
That's the big question, and the evidence is, again, quite debated. Some analyses find a small statistical effect for subliminal ads on choice, maybe. But other studies looking at things like hidden images in ads found no significant impact. Plus, actually doing these studies is tricky. How do you ensure the stimulus is truly subliminal for everyone? It's hard to rule out tiny bits of conscious awareness sometimes. The effects, when found, tend to be small and not very reliable for practical manipulation.
Okay. And what about this idea of deliberation without attention? Does our unconscious mind make better decisions sometimes? Does that open a door for control?
That's another interesting area. The theory suggests that for really complex choices, letting your unconscious mull it over might lead to better results than trying to consciously track every single factor. But it's controversial. Some argue that when conscious thought performs poorly, it's maybe because we're using the wrong conscious strategy, not because the unconscious is inherently superior for these tasks. So while it highlights unconscious processing, it doesn't really imply susceptibility to external control in the way we've been discussing. It's more about internal decision-making styles.
It really seems the scientific support for powerful, reliable subconscious control, whether internal or external, is, well, limited at best.
Based on the materials we have, yes.
Let's shift gears slightly. What about our own minds? Cognitive biases. How could they make people believe in something like widespread, secret subconscious remote control?
That's a really important angle. Cognitive biases are these sort of mental shortcuts our brains use, but they can lead to systematic errors in judgment. They can definitely influence belief in claims that lack strong evidence.
Can you give some examples? How might they apply here?
Sure. Take anchoring bias. We tend to latch onto the first piece of information we get. So if you first encounter a really compelling story about government mind control, even if it's unverified, that can heavily skew how you see any later evidence.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
There's the availability bias. We overestimate the importance of things that easily come to mind. Think about how often mind control pops up in movies or TV shows. Those vivid examples, even fictional, can make the idea seem more plausible or common than it is.
Right.
And the focusing illusion, we might focus too much on one detail, maybe a strange personal experience we can't explain, and jump to an explanation like external control, ignoring other possibilities.
So our own thinking patterns can kind of lead us down these paths, even without solid proof.
Exactly. And it's not just biases. Our motivations matter too. We might be more likely to accept information that fits our existing worldview, like distrust of government because it feels more comfortable, reduces uncertainty. That's cognitive consistency. And sometimes emotional responses can override critical thinking when we evaluate information, especially sensational claims or misinformation.
So if someone already distrusts authority, they might be more receptive to these kinds of narratives regardless of the actual evidence presented.
It certainly makes it easier for such beliefs to take root and persist, yes.
Okay, one last area before we wrap up. Subliminal techniques again, but more in the context of persuasion or self-help. That came up too.
Right. There's a distinction often made between the controversial idea of subliminal advertising trying to make you buy things and the use of subliminal affirmations in, say, self-help recordings.
Like messages meant to boost confidence or change habits, played below awareness.
Exactly. The idea there, often discussed in online communities, is that positive messages bypassing the conscious critical mind might be better absorbed by the subconscious, though scientifically the effectiveness is still debated, similar to advertising.
Did the sources mention anything about how these are supposed to work, if they do?
Well, some user discussions emphasize repetition and consistency, the idea being that repeated exposure, even subliminally, might gradually influence subconscious patterns. Again, this is more user belief in theory than proven science across the board. And as we noted, the meta-analysis on advertising showed maybe a weak effect, but other research on specific types of subliminal content found little impact.
And we should probably quickly mention popular culture's role, too. Mind control is everywhere in fiction, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sci-fi books, movies, games. It's a staple trope. And that constant exposure definitely shapes how people perceive the possibility, maybe making these complex, difficult-to-achieve ideas seem more feasible or even commonplace than it might be in reality.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. We've looked at this hypothesis, governments hiding subconscious remote control.
We've touched on the core idea of influencing the subconscious, looked at the history with MKUltra, which shows definite government interest in mind manipulation in the past.
Right, then we examined the really dramatic contemporary claims of things like synthetic telepathy and RNM, noting those come from specific, unverified sources in our material.
And contrasted that with the scientific perspective, which is generally pretty skeptical about the feasibility of precise remote mind control given brain complexity and the limits of current tech, including Delgado's earlier work.
We also considered how our own cognitive biases might make us susceptible to believing such claims and the mixed evidence around subliminal influence.
And finally, the cultural backdrop of mind control in fiction.
Throughout this, we've really tried to stick to examining the information objectively, laying out the different facets.
And based purely on the sources we reviewed for this deep dive, the conclusion has to be that the existence and deliberate concealment of widespread, effective subconscious remote control technology by governments, well, it remains unproven. The historical context raises serious ethical flags about past research, absolutely. But the leap to current sophisticated hidden control technologies isn't substantiated by the broader evidence presented here.
Thanks for listening to Conspiracist.